anybody would find it interesting, not only those who are in academia, but even Shias especially, who want to know more about the disciples of the Imams. Yeah, the book is called The Heirs of the Prophet, Charisma and Religious Authority in Shiite Islam. The book was published in 2006, but I started working on it actually. The ideas came to my mind when I was researching in Iran in the 1980s. It was then that I attended lectures by Ayatollah Jafar Subhani, who was giving lectures in an area called Masumiyah, for those who know Qum, very close to the Haram. Yeah. And he was talking about Ilm al-Rijal, basically. And that's when I got really interested in the topic. After my research work, I did my doctorate in London, England, and I realized that this topic had not been discussed extensively in the Western academia. So I dedicated my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, to the topic of the Rijal. I must tell you that London was quite challenging because I did my dissertation at the SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies in London. It was challenging because it still had that kind of Orientalist mindset, whereby people like Wansborough, Crone, Houghton was my supervisor, Professor Norman Calder was one of my was the external examiner. So that kind of perspective I had to deal with, and it looked as if that that Shiism was in kind of an offshoot of Sunni Islam. So there was quite a bit of, shall we say, disagreement between me and my supervisor, but we agreed to disagree agreeably. He said, as long as you can defend yourself, that's fine. So I talked about the Rijal in about 7-8 chapters, I remember, what I call Ilm al-Rijal, and focus on some parts of the relationship between the Imams and the Rijal. Then later on, I had to develop the thesis into a book, and in consultation with various people, including Professor Sajidina, he told me that it would be good if I was to use some kind of theoretical framework for the book. In other words, the theory of authority. More specifically, he suggested I look at Max Weber's idea of authority, which I did. And therefore, this book came about, quite a revision from my thesis. But very briefly, I looked at the question of charisma, because Max Weber does talk of charisma and the dissipation of charismatic authority. That is, when the charismatic authority passes away, what happens with the charisma? Max Weber talked of different kinds of charisma, not only charismatic authority, but the routinization of charisma, the hereditary charisma, and so on. So I focused on the hereditary charisma because that is what fitted the Shia instance most. And I focused in the first chapter on what I call the Shar'i man. Shar'i man is equivalent to the Jewish concept of the halachic man, that is the man of the Sharia. Here I compared how the Shar'i man appears in Sunni Islam, how he appears in Shia Islam, and the concept of the heirs of the Prophet, because there's a very famous hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, where he says, Al-ulama warathul anbiya, the ulama are the heirs of the Prophet. But there are comparative traditions in which the Sufis also claim to be the heirs of the Prophet, the philosophers do. So I looked at more specifically in the Shia case, how that appears, the history of the Shar'i man in Shia Islam. And in the second chapter, I looked at the concept of the holy man, because we believe that our imams were not just people of the Sharia, but they had the spiritual qualities. So the second chapter was more focused on the spirituality, the holiness of the imams. But I also looked at how this concept of holiness was appropriated by the close disciples. In other words, the Rijal, as I call them, the close companions of the imams, were not only disciples, they occupied the position as both the Shar'i man and to some degree as the holy man in Shia Islam. Although they were not equivalent to the imams, but at least they could appropriate what we call imam-like attributes. The third chapter, I think, is the most fascinating chapter for me in this book, and probably the most controversial one, because we know historically the Imams could not function in different parts of the Muslim world. They had to delegate their authority, and they dedicated their authority to the disciples, people like Zurara bin A'yan, Muhammad bin Muslim, Hisham bin al-Hakam, and so on. And this led to what I call the routinization of authority in Shia Islam. Previously, I talked of the hereditary charisma, that is, the charisma of the Prophet was inherited by the Imams. Here we're talking of the Imam's authority being delegated to his disciples. So the disciples do not actually acquire the features of the Imam, but they acquire what we may call the routinized authority of the Imams. And gradually, the disciples themselves became leading figures on their own, primarily because of this delegation of the authority. But gradually, I found that there was a clash of authority, what we may call the universal authority of the Imams and the regional authority of the disciples of the Imams. Not only was there a clash between the Imams and the disciples, but also between the disciples themselves. Let's not forget at this time Shia Islam was still in a very formative stage. Ideas, beliefs, even the hadith literature, the legal edifice of the Shia Islam was still in a very formative state. So there were quite a few discussions. And I also discovered that there was what we may call the independent-minded Rijal. That is, some of the disciples were not completely obedient to the Imam, shall we say. They used their own what we call Ra'i. And here the clash was between the Riwayah and Ra'i. Riwayah from the Imams, and Ra'i means opinions or independent views of some of the Rijal, which led to the clash of authority. And the classical work here, I should mention, is that of Muhammad bin Umar al-Kashi. Kashi's work is seminal and very important to this. It shows us the authority and the clash of authority. And of course, some of the disciples were therefore cursed by the Imams. If you look at Kashi's work carefully. But it wasn't only in Kashi's work, even in some of the Hadith work, you find this clash of authority. So that was, I think, the most interesting part of the book, which is chapter 3. In chapter 4, I looked at some of the functions of the Rijal. In other words, what did they do? How did they function? What are some of the achievements of the Rijal? And these varied. They were responsible for acknowledging the successor of the Imams, hence they become very important, because many times the Shia did not know who was going to succeed an Imam. It was the Rijal's acknowledgement that led to other Shias acknowledging the succeeding Imams. The Rijal, that is the disciples, also functions as the Muhaddithun, that is the reported the tradition of the Imams. They wrote many books. They also became the Hukam, the judges in the Shia world. They were engaged in polemics against non-Shias. Primarily we find people like Aban bin Taghlib to some degree, but certainly people like Hisham bin al-Hakam, who engaged in various polemical debates with non-Shias, and quite a few others. And the Rijal, to be honest, they occupied various roles. Sometimes they were jurists, sometimes they were doing other things also. So they had different roles within the Shia world. So it wasn't just one function. At the same time, also, I should make it clear that we can talk of a community within a community. In other words, the Rijal were functioning as a community within the larger Muslim communities. There was a Shia community which had its own jurists, its own muhaddithun, its own hukam, and so on, functioning. And they also function as wukala, let's not forget, as administrators to the Imams. And the final chapter in the work, chapter 5, talks of the various structures and features of construction of authority. How is authority constructed in the Shia world, especially what we may call textual authority? In what form is authority constructed in the text? Because I find that there is a struggle for legitimacy. That is, there are those scholars within the Shia world who want to portray a hagiographical idealization, not only of the Imams, but also of the disciples of the Imams. So we find, for example, legends and miraculous abilities attributed to the Imams themselves and to some degree to the disciples of the Imams. A classical work here would be Sheikh al-Mufid's book, Kitab al-Irshad. And yet we find that, especially in Qadsi's work, some of these legends and miraculous abilities were also attributed to some of the disciples of the Imam. I talk of the textual authority. In other words, how is authority constructed through the text, through forms of authentication, tawthiqat, al-amma wal-khassa, the general and the specific construction of authority. And what happens is that the rijal gradually assume more authority in the text than they had in the world in their own times. And for this, what I did was to look at how the rijal's authority evolved with time. And I should give credit here to my supervisor, Professor Jez Houghton, who helped me develop the notion of textual authority. And what he did was to ask me to look at some of the companions, and I picked on 4 of them in my dissertation, to see how that authority evolves by comparison of Sunni and Shia biographical works. So, for example, Jabir bin Yazid al-Ju'fi, Aban bin Taghlib, Zurara bin A'yan, and Hisham bin al-Hakam. I look at how their authorities, the construction of authority, develops through time, both in the Sunni and Shia biographical literature. And that's about the end of the book. One thing is for sure, that academic works like this one are not going to be bestsellers. I would like to think that anybody would find it interesting, not only those who are in academia, but even Shias especially, who want to know more about the disciples of the Imams. I would submit that some parts of the book are a bit dense, if you like. They're not easy reading. You have to read it with a bit more care. You cannot just lie on a Sunday afternoon on the beach and read it and understand it. So it's a bit more dense in some parts of the book. But overall, I think that it's primarily geared towards students, and especially graduate students. And of course, scholars in Islam who would find such a notion interesting. But at the same time, I would be hoping that even the general Shia audience would like to read it. It has received good reviews mostly, although not everybody agrees with what I said. But I think that it was breaking new ground, because when it was published, this was 14 years ago, in 2006, it was the first major comprehensive work on the disciples of the Imam. There were other books that were published, not books, but I would say articles written about the disciples, but not in great depth and length. What I'd like to think that this work covers 2 aspects, the breadth and the depth, as I always focus on my students, breadth and depth on a particular topic that you want to cover.